Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry for the technical glitches early on today, but that's technology for you, and we're working remotely. Kind of following on from Mike's discussion, I want to give you a bit of a perspective from a Transport for Greater Manchester perspective on what we see the opportunities are related to these 15-minute neighbourhoods and the link to mobility hub. I'm Sam Lee. I'm the Senior Innovation Officer in TfGM. So some of you may be aware of Greater Manchester and kind of the environments it's coordinating in. We manage, as Transport for Greater Manchester, 10 different districts. And you can see from this diagram, it's very traditionally about feeding into the regional centre. But in a post-pandemic environment, that's all changed in terms of how people access services, how people access employment and the education and health as a whole. So I think there's been a lot of discussions about a 15-minute neighborhood, but what is it really? Everybody has a different perception of it. I think for us is taking kind of spatial design and planning with a more citizen-centric way of looking at future planning and what mobility provisions are needed. Look at creating these localized ecosystem that allows community to grow and thrive and access services in a more sustainable way as a whole. So what are the things that should be considered as part of this? Should we be start to considering the impact of healthcare? How do we provide for education, employment, and kind of everyday service? And so you can see, as Mike mentioned already, Paris were at the forefront of, championing this idea. But how do we go about planning and implementing some of this as a whole? So this is a really good diagram, actually, that was published recently through a report Glenn's put together, Lionel's put together around this transition of our focus from a spatial kind of proximity focus to more digital connectivity focus, and almost the modes in some ways a bit of an afterthought now of how it connects together. But it's how we leverage that now moving forward, making sure that we capsulate and plan things with that digital connectivity in mind and that new style and lifestyle in mind. So the pandemic has fundamentally accelerated the shift on how people access services, but is that better for the future as a whole? We're starting to see the return of the on-demand goods delivery. So startups like the Milkman and Modern Day Milkman, which is reinventing, what we've done for many years and incorporate it in a more localized environment. How could that work? How it provides kind of services as a whole. This change in the retail experience for food and service. Is this more on-demand kind of proposition better for our ecosystem and how we manage mobility as a whole? Because traditionally we manage mobility in the sense of people going to services rather than the other way around. Are these new services going to be more environmentally sustainable than people driving to the shops? If we're expecting more on-demand deliveries that are done on a day-to-day basis rather than a weekly basis. As you can see from the diagram, is not always Uber Eats and delivery drive people on bikes. They're potentially on cars and kind of vans and stuff. So how do we link into that as a whole? And as I touched on already, future of education and healthcare. How can that be provided in a smarter way? And about that building that localized community. What do we need to facilitate that to reduce the necessary mobility travel as part of the agenda? So what does this new kind of lifestyle means for the supply chain? I think a lot of times we just think about the goods coming to us. We don't really think about the next day delivery impact, and what it could mean on the ecosystem. And I think there is a big piece around freight that we need to consider, that people will take this convenience that they've acquired to over the pandemic and kind of persist with it. So what are the provisions players like TfGM of public sector need to provide to facilitate for some of this? Is it EV charging for micro freight kind of providers, with their e-vans and cargo bikes? How do we manage our future space, in terms of curbside management? Is there provision around storage lockers as a way for goods to be picked up, linking to people accessing that neighborhood hub kind of proposition and kind of future space? How do we manage, these tight spaces that we have within the regional centres as well as kind of our district towns as a whole? And I think all of this brings into the question of what data do we need to now gather to make those decisions and better understand the spaces that we need to hold on to, or spaces that we can potentially retrofit, to serve that purpose, to build those kind of hubs to enable the 50-minute neighborhoods. So one component around geospatial data to better understand requirements and location. What are the energy and power requirements, for these players moving forward, like EV and hydrogen? What are the digital connectivity requirements in these community hubs if we're talking about co-working spaces and so on and so forth? And how does all of this link into current transport infrastructure and planning for future infrastructure like micromobilities on e-scooters, e-bikes, and autonomous drones for deliveries, for example? On the other side, with COVID, we've highlighted a new way of understanding movement. The pandemic has shown that the power of mobile phone data for us to really understand how people are accessing the city and utilizing their services as a whole, and to be compliant with the various measures that government has put in place. But now on the other side, future digital payment, COVID has accelerated this move towards cashless. And we've seen kind of Visa's kind of contactless payment reaching almost 70% of transactions within the UK. That data that we can now link to mobility will provide us a good understanding of the need of people in the city and how they access the various points and the services that they need to and services we need to cater for if we are moving towards this more localized 15 neighborhood proposition. And I think what's really exciting is that linking that to online transactions as well moving forward, to understand how goods are being moved from the likes of Amazon or ordered from Uber Eats and Deliveroo to a geospatial kind of perspective, and linking and capturing those new modes and new behaviors that's Transport Authority we don't really see or aware of at the moment. So all of this links back into this proposition around how we bring all this data in to create a new planning tool to help us determine where these mobility hubs should be, because it's my belief that mobility hubs could become the foundation and the center point of these 15-minute neighborhoods that we're trying to build. But it's really trying to understand what are the components associated with these mobility hubs based on the data we capture. What provisions do we need to invest in terms of infrastructure moving forward and planning moving forward? So could we retrofit things like existing park and ride sites to provide local access to micromobility for the final mile, as well as storage lockers and kind of other propositions to help grow that local community? Components could change over time. I think at current, a lot of the thinking is around just mobility and amenities. Things like dark kitchens and kind of other propositions are becoming more and more prominent with especially kind of the rise of the on-demand delivery for food. So mobility hub, could they become a distribution point for kind of on-demand delivery for food in the future? How do we build the solutions for that, both in physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure? And I think the last point around mobility hub we need to start thinking a bit more around as a public sector authority is, what is the business models associated with it? I think to date, a lot of the mobility hubs we've considered as a location where we co-locate a number of different mobility components and amenities. But is there a different way that could be delivered, in a more community-based approach where it's managed, by a local housing developer that is part of the new housing developments, to add value to the local community and service provision for this new lifestyle and normal? What personas do we need to try and build to understand how people travel and access these services moving forward as a whole? So for us in Greater Manchester, we've been quite lucky in terms of accessing funding to trial these in the local environment and really understand by doing and trialing what are the behaviour that we expect from people when they utilise these mobility hubs. So as part of the project, we're working with Interreg Northwest. And we're looking into implementing a number of different mobility provisions, ranging from impost storage lockers to cargo e-cargo bikes, and then enterprise car clubs to start exploring what are the propositions related to reducing car ownership if we are moving towards these 15-minute neighbourhoods, where people can access all the amenities and key services within the local area. But this is just the first step. As the hub develops, what can we incorporate into this, moving forward? If we have the seamless connectivity, could there be opportunity for a mobile GP to be set up at these mobility hubs? Mobile libraries to provide people access to the internet and other kind of immersive services. And what does that look like from a future of education point of view? It opens up huge opportunity, creating this kind of community space that links into wider lifestyle needs and mobility changes as we go. So just to kind of sum up, I think we're seeing kind of a lot of work being done in this sort of area, and the problem comes back to there's no clear data and insight to really understand where the ideal locations are that we should be implementing these hubs, how we model and simulate some of this. So our key focus moving forward would be implementing the trial and feeding that insight and data into this planning tool that we're developing, as well as starting to engage with commercial partners to really see what are the opportunity with a mobility hub implementation. Should the business model be associated with public sector partner being the core tenant to implement these solutions, or is there opportunity linking this to future planning guidance for housing developers, to offer a mobility hub as an alternative to parking and kind of other means as well? I think the core message I want people to take away with as well is that we're no longer looking at mobility in this isolation. Everything is connected in some way and shape or form, and we need to take that consideration into mind, that connectivity, both in the energy, digital and physical, when we do plan future implementation for mobility as a whole, and not looking at just building building supply to cater for the traditional demand, but really start building those data sets of personas so that we can understand the customer in a data-driven way and start forming policies and kind of mobility implementation decisions based on that changing lifestyle as a whole. So I guess the cool question to leave you away with: could mobility hubs become the center of future of these 50-minute neighborhoods? What are the key components, that we definitely should be considering that we're not looking at the moment? And for the audience, what are the biggest barriers, they see moving forward? So thank you very much for listening to me today. Do get in touch if you are interested in the project and plan on hearing more, but I'm looking forward to taking some questions in the Q&A. Thanks.